Welcome to Hot Air, Cool People with Dr. Anna Gunz, a podcast devoted to cool professionals with cool ideas for a planet full of hot air. In this episode, Dr. Gunz speaks with Dr. Tom Cull, a poet, educator, and community organizer in London, Ontario.
Welcome. Thank you for coming.
Well, thanks. It's so nice to be here.
So I wanted to get the opportunity to chat to you because I think you're doing a lot of fascinating things. And I think the first thing I'd like to talk to you about is what you're doing locally in London, Ontario with the local river.
Yeah. So 11 years ago now, my partner and I, her name is Miriam Love, we came together. We both had recently moved to London, actually, separately. And we came together and started dating. And one thing that we like to do a lot is walk along the river and the Thames Valley Parkway, which is the path that goes alongside the river. And so we would walk together with Miriam's son, now our son, was 1.5 at the time. So I met the two of them and we kind of, over the next couple of years, gradually kind of became a family. And I think one of the ways that happened was through the river. We would spend a lot of time, as you know, in London, we have a beautiful river, Dashkanzibi or Antler River in Anishinaabeg-Moen, also known as the Thames River by its colonial name. And so it has these it comes to the forks at the center of the town, and it has these wonderful bike paths along it. And so, yeah, we kind of got to know each other walking that river, and we noticed there was a lot of garbage in it along the banks. And so that's why we started this group, Antler River Rally, which began as Thames River Rally. We didn't know the river by any other name at that time. And the idea was pretty simple. We wanted to do something that was direct and that could get citizens, people, community members directly involved in the health of the river in the most, I'm using the word direct a lot, the most direct way possible, which is just like getting their hands dirty and picking up garbage. And so, yeah, I think the first one, we just threw up a Facebook notice that we were going to go down to the river, and we had some extra gloves and some garbage bags and asked people to join us to help clean up this one park behind Labatt's Brewery there, Carfrey Park. I think it's now called Hunt Park. But yeah, so that's what we did. And so we went, our first cleanup, one person came, our friend, Jeff, came to that cleanup. We took some photos and yeah, it was great. We spent like 3 hours, just the four of us, cleaning up the river. And that was, this is our humble beginning story. And yeah, so that's how it started. And 11 years later, we're doing monthly cleanups, sometimes more than once a month. I think this in the month of September and October, we did one every weekend. So like 8 over the course of like 2 months. This year has been very busy for river cleanups. And we've worked with thousands and thousands of volunteers. I think we had a cleanup this summer at the Westminster Ponds ESA that we had 160 people show up for. And so obviously, from one volunteer showing up to 160 for one cleanup, that's a big jump in numbers. And, we've kept it simple. We haven't become a non-for-profit or a charity. We've kind of looked at, the possibility of going down those roads. But it just seemed like all of that was going to take us away from the work, being in the river, being along the banks, and, doing that kind of direct work. And so we've survived as a community organization, and we've grown as an organization, a grassroots organization. And, when we need funding, we go to the groups that have that status, and we do flow through, or people just give to us directly because they don't care about getting tax receipts. And also we just kind of, we keep it lean, and we don't have big costs, and we have a core group of organizers who, help with the social media and the organizing of it. And over the years, we've kind of branched out from just doing this work to doing all kinds of work around advocating for a healthy river and for, water protection, and basically kind of doing anything we can in the city that involves, the health of the river. So, we, fought to have the Springbank Dam decommissioned because it was a dam that didn't do anything in terms of flood prevention. It was purely a recreational dam. Dams are not good for watershed health for a whole bunch of reasons that, I won't get into. I can, but so yeah, we really fought to have that dam decommissioned. So that's just like one example. But we've also got involved in, thinking more holistically about environmentalism and I teach creative writing at Western. I teach nature writing at Western. And one of the things about the environmentalist movement is that it's kind of has deep roots in, white supremacy and colonialism. And so trying to kind of like something that I'm trying to unpack in terms of how I teach nature writing and nature writing's how do I say? Anyway, nature writing is complicit in the colonial project. And so trying to kind of think about that while also thinking about the environmental work that we do and thinking about it less as an environmental group and more in terms of social justice. So drawing the connections between the health of the river and the fact that Oneida Nation of the Thames, 20 minutes downstream, doesn't currently, can't drink its water. They're on a boil water advisory. And so, doing cleanups at Oneida, building relationships with Oneida Nations of the Thames, Chippewa of the Thames, and Munsee, Delaware Nation, trying to build those relationships while also thinking about, redefining our relationship, with the river itself. So, yeah, so those things are important. And of course, then also the question of social justice and what's happening with the river right here in London, Ontario, and the challenge it's facing right now as our populations of people experiencing homelessness are on the rise. And one of the places that folks camp rough is along the river. And so also trying to kind of work on that issue, as well as thinking about its relationship to the river as a whole. Yeah, I was just trying to kind of, get at some of the ways that like Antler River Rally began as with a very kind of simple mandate that we still have, which is like getting people down to the river, getting their hands dirty, getting them seeing the problems and the challenges that the river faces, which are many, and some of them are quite complex and interrelated and, dovetail with a lot of social justice issues. And so if you get people down and you're working together on a Saturday and you're just, pulling garbage out of the river and creating a community around that, you can start to have really important conversations about, greater ecological questions and the river's connection to those greater ecological questions, which include, social issues like ongoing colonial violence, like the growing homelessness population across Canada, like, housing crisis, opioid epidemic, all of these things that people kind of aren't maybe expecting when they come down to the river because they think they're coming down to address a litter issue. And, again, talking about litter, the litter bug is like the big bad boogeyman of in some people's minds. And, sure, there are people who litter, right? But that, like, in terms of the ecological health of the river, littering is just a kind of symptom of a much greater problem we have, right? With consumption and problems with, where we don't live sustainably. And yeah, but wanting to always bring people back to the river and pulling a 6-pack ring out of the river and pulling, garbage out of the river together with your neighbor, and it's really important for us. And it also allows, the one thing I really like about it is that, environmentalism shouldn't be, everything's political, obviously, right? But we really welcome the fact that, when you come to the river, you're talking with people, you're outside of the echo chamber of your own politics often, which is nice. certainly online, we're always within our echo chambers. Within our friendship groups, we're within our echo chambers. When you're down at the river, you can have, you make surprising connections, with folks who care about the river. And you have to contend with that. And you have to contend with your own biases. And you also end up having interesting conversations where you feel yourself challenged and you're challenging other people. But because you're also just working on something and you're pulling garbage out of the river and you've got this shared purpose, it kind of softens antagonisms that you might normally, that are obviously, those fires are stoked when you're online. Online is designed to get us, all worked up and angry. When you're both like trying to figure out a way to get a grappling hook tossed into the river to catch and get a shopping cart out of the river, and you're having these kinds of conversations, it's very different, right? Because you're unified in a kind of goal and you found a common ground. And then you start to have these larger questions about, like, you can have very differing opinions about the fact that you're picking up needles at the river, right? And some people have never even heard of the language of harm reduction, right? And some people are still very much, as I think we all are in some ways, we've all grown up within the kind of the rhetoric of the war on drugs, right? And the criminality of health issues. Anyway, so that's why I love the work, and I think it's important, that we keep doing it. And we've changed as we've evolved as an organization, but that one thing that never changes is just going back to the river.
One of the things I wonder about is, you're clear on what you get out of it and what you found, and probably what other people have got out of coming and volunteering. But what do you think draws people in the first place to come and take care of this river?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I talk to students about rivers and waterways, the first thing I ask is, what are your earliest memories of water? What are your earliest memories of, when you became kind of conscious of nature and or animals and the living world around us? And, you get these very early kind of important memories around water or around, forests. People talk about going to cottages or remembering to a grandparent teaching them how to swim, or going fishing, or seeing, disturbing images like a fish that the first fish that you caught, and then you reel it in, and so exciting, and then watching it die, or gasping for breath, or, wanting to put it back, and so, I think that I personally, like, I grew up on a river in southwestern Ontario, and I think we have these kind of, many people have these deep relationships with water. And so I think we're drawn to water, and I think people are drawn back. Memory draws us back to rivers, and there's a power to water that I think people recognize. I think there's a reason that people who are camping rough end up along the river. It's not only because those are spaces that are available, but water is contemplative. Water, we're made of water. I think we're kind of like, there's an elemental draw to water, but we go to these spaces because we witness a certain kind of power of a river, the way water moves, the way water is a kind of medium of connection. Like it connects us together as a city. And I'm also, I think there's something mysterious. We're drawn to mystery. We're drawn to we're curious as a species, I think. And water is a mysterious thing. The surface of the water is this kind of space between above and below. And the mysteries of what is underneath the water are very, very powerful. And, many of our important stories, early stories that we read, are around water. And so I think culturally, cross-culturally as well, water is kind of important and fundamental. I think for some people, water is a place. I know for me, it's a habitat. It's a place where our, animal relatives live, and their lives are fascinating and they're important and they have immense, value. So when I'm down at the river and I see a mink hunting goslings in the spring, or kind of slipping between rocks, there's something that is just so powerful and amazing about that. So I think we're also drawn to water, for those reasons. So I think I made a film with Brandon Dockstader, who's a counselor and at Oneida Nation of the Thames. He's also the environmental coordinator, where we did cleanups together, both at Oneida and in London. And we just asked people, like, what's your earliest memory of water and why is water important to you? And we got so many different, a lot of certain kind of themes came up, like water is life. And a lot of people shared their deeply personal memories with water and its importance to them. And some of them weren't inside houses, like water as cooking, or the importance of water and steam. That's the other great thing about water is as an element, it changes. It changes from frozen, to solid, to liquid, to vapor. I mean, what a wonderful and an amazing kind of thing this water is. And so in this film we were just I was blown away by like how people both had these kind of like, we came back to these touchstones, but also everyone had this, there's a great kind of diversity in the answers of why people are pulled to water. And I think in London, people are drawn to the water because they also see the garbage and they see that there's something that's not right about this. There's something that just is inside them. Is it a moral imperative? Who knows what it is? Is it biological drive? I don't know what it is, but something says this is not right. It's not okay that we have this beautiful river. I think people understand, have gratitude, are grateful for nature. And I think that when they see it degraded, when they see its health compromised, they understand, just like when they see an animal suffering or they see another human suffering. When you see a landscape suffering, you can feel that in certain ways, and it's just not okay. And so our people are drawn to help, I think, and make that right. And I think that these are all really powerful forces. And again, another reason that, I keep coming back to the same places. We keep coming back to the same places again and again and again to clean up the same garbage. And people say, doesn't it get like it disheartening? Doesn't it, isn't it futile? Isn't it like, Sisyphus rolling, the stone up the hill? And I mean, of course, that's life. It's in some ways. So it is discouraging and challenging, but it's also so important, for those very reasons. Yeah. And so that's a great question. I've never been asked that question before, and I'm going to steal it. I'm going to steal it and ask people that question as well for my students, because I think that's thanks for that. Thank you. I'm grateful for that opportunity to reflect on that question.
Another thing that I was thinking about as you were talking is, I mean, I have my own relationships with water, as we all do, and everyone has this implicit relationship with nature and water, but in this colonial world that we live in, we're the masters of compartmentalizing. And that's one of the things that I'm so curious about, is trying to have these conversations with people who have this explicit recognition of their relationship, that we need to keep having these conversations so that we don't compartmentalize our life and our consumption in the way that we did. It doesn't have to be a negative conversation. But I also realized the connectivity in my life when I went from studies in earth sciences, and my favorite, it's fascinated by fluvial geomorphology, which is just how water changed the landscape and how waters and rivers change. And then I went into medical school and I had no clue Everything was new. But then one of our first blocks was cardiology, and I felt this immense relief because now we're talking about arteries and how they flow into smaller arteries and into capillary beds. And we were using exactly the same equations as we were when we were standing in a river with our, feet in the ground, with our measuring tape and our little, whatever that instrument is that spins round and round and measures the currents. And I was, okay, finally, I understand this. And atherosclerosis, I'm like, that same thing happens to rivers. So without maybe the inflammation. And it was my relief. It was like, okay, finally I have some grounding. I can put my feet somewhere. I know it's not a forest or trees, but I'll get here.
Yeah, I love that, the bringing those two together, and the delight also of like drawing those connections too. Just, yeah, and I also just love fluvial geomorphology. I mean, I'm going to write a poem called Fluvial Geomorphology. I'm surprised I haven't already. But yeah, that's also something that I talk about when I lead walks or writing walks along the river, is about hydrology and what a river does, and or even when I'm in schools talking about the water cycle, like the kind of like the basic water cycle, and how, yeah, rivers convey, that's what one of the things that they convey, sentiment, sediment and sentiment, but they are conveyors, right? And they convey water, but they convey all these different things. I mean, I use that as a line because as a poet, I can't ignore when I'm reading like about hydrology and it says, rivers convey water. And I'm like, yeah. So one of my lines in a poem is, what does the river convey? I mean, it conveys, so much. And I love when you have these kind of this stacking of like, fluvial geomorphology with poetry, right? And I think that that's also something that is just so amazing about water, how it's so large and expansive that it can kind of like, account for all of those things. I one more thing, and this is going off topic a little bit, but like one thing I love about water is that, I read somewhere that like all the water that's on the earth has always been on the earth. We don't lose any, we don't gain any. This is what we have, and some of that water will be locked up in an iceberg for 20,000 years. And some of that water, moves fairly quickly, but it all moves and it all changes around the planet, kind of like air, I guess, in some ways. I mean, and maybe it's not as profound as I think it is, but certainly when I heard that for the first time, I just kind of, it just, I don't know, like the one aspect of religion that I really like, or religions, I should say, is how they can, I think, exist in mystery and mysticism and questioning and all of the, and that to me again is something that like water speaks. It whispers those kind of really interesting questions.
I think another thing I really like about water and rivers is the rivers age and they become meandering streams. And it's just something so beautiful about that image I can never get out of my head, as I am so lucky to live a lot along the side of this river here, and she's beautiful. There's so much life that it's so much peace that you can get from just walking into the river.
Yeah, it's like, a river that's over 10,000 years in the making, right? Created by spillways from the last glacier that kind of came, and then this river has this kind of immense, like that's the other thing at the history and thinking about like a deep geological time and rivers, right? And like I a couple of things, like the fact that like mastodons used to wander along these rivers 9,000 years ago, if I remember correctly the actual date, but they found remains very close to where we are here in London, and to kind of like cast one's mind back to kind of imagine what this river looked like. And yeah, and they age and they transform the landscape, and they slither along the landscape. I went to the United States. Where was I? In St. Louis, and we went out to see we went to a museum to see a steamship that had been found completely preserved from the 19th century, early 19th century, in a farmer's field. That, of course, was where that ship went down. And the river's course now is about 3 miles east of it. And so, rivers move across a landscape over time. They have this vitalism. They are alive. And that's just, the history of it is also something to kind of like mark and think about its lifespan. That's so amazing to me.
I think, this spills right into this concept of colonialism and white supremacy. I mean, you just made me think about the river down in the US where, everyone has these water rights in these different states, and they're running into all of these different problems. Like anyone could own water. Like, it's like even the idea of land ownership it's just so fundamentally messed up, but is what we do. But this idea different states have their rights to this water, and they're all suffering. And, it comes back to this river again, and this concept of colonialism and white supremacy. That's this course through nature poetry. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think there's so much that you know about that's such a gift of knowledge.
Yeah. Gosh. So it's interesting, like how we've, sidebar for a second. Yeah. About like how we've tried to kind of like, the instrumentalization of nature, right, and turning things into resources which are plundered, and all these use value and all this kind of stuff, and how we've kind of straitjacketed rivers, or tried to, with dams, and to kind of like harness that resource in certain ways, and
the massive irony of the bold water advisories, which are so wrong. And it's such environmental racism. But you're thinking about how fundamental water is to all of us, that's what it is. It's the bold water advisories. That's what we're doing.
Yeah, it's so. I'm reading a book, or I've read a book called Under a White Sky by Elizabeth Colbert. The future, or it's called The Future of Nature. And it's just an amazing book. A lot of it is about rivers in the United States. And anyway, I won't go down that road, but it's such an interesting book in the way that, like, for example, the flooding of New Orleans was created by the way that we've managed, or the United States, or whatever, have managed that river and stopped it from doing what it needs to actually do. And so it's just, and anyway, when you have a moment, to check out the poem Powwow at the End of the Earth by Sherman Alexie, which it kind of makes me cry when I read it every time. It's hard. It's such a beautiful poem. But so the history of colonialism, and the idea of terra nullius, right, or free land that you can just claim because it's no one's living there, right? And terra nullius, and the doctrine of discovery, right, which was these, papal bulls that allowed colonial nations, or kind of gave the legal framework and the justification for just taking land in what was understood as the New World, right? And
if you could farm it if it wasn't farmed in European ways. And what a loss of knowledge and food insecurity that has spilled over, and we're living now from.
I mean, it's such an irony. Like, I know more, like I taught American studies for a number of years at Western, because my PhD is in American literature. And so I've studied the kind of, the history of the United States. And it's such an irony of the fact that, like, the American identity and American whiteness was so predicated on a kind of othering of Indigenous peoples and the othering of, indigeneity in the mind of settlers. Yet it's central to American identity, and it's still, you see it in so many continued iterations today. But the irony of that, centrality, happening at the same time where it's like, yeah, we can claim this land because there's no one here, right? Or there's no one who matters here, right? That is one of the kind of another ongoing central irony. But yeah, I think there is a kind of way, like, for example, like literature of the frontier is a good example of how literature of the frontier reinforces this idea, that the whole idea actually of the frontier, at least in the American context, right, of the conquering of this land and the testing of so much of America, it was defined in kind of like counter distinction to Europe, right? Like we are a different country, and that was forged very famously. Frederick Jackson Turner wrote this essay called "The Frontier," or is it "The Myth of the Frontier"? Anyway, this idea that, the identity of the nation is forged on a frontier, civilizing nature, and, countering the savagery of the Indigenous other, all of these kinds of ideas were central to the making of both Canada and the United States. And it was reinforced by literature. If you can kind of think of like, American heroes like Boone or Hawkeye from, The Last of the Mohicans. These are kind of like ongoing kind of myths of, the settler whose mettle is tested by the frontier, who is, rises to the challenge of the kind of the savagery of the other. All of these kinds of ideas were, and we still see them in popular culture, but these ideas were transmitted through literature. Even the idea of kind of like walking, like the idea of the sublime, which is a really important idea in romanticism, American romanticism, the idea that you kind of walk into nature, and nature is this kind of wild place where you have this sublime encounter with God. And it's through this kind of sublime encounter that, you commune with the oversoul, or you find the self, or whatever, what have you. And of course, there's a complete erasure of indigeneity, Indigenous peoples, nations, and, a whole thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years of history and culture. And the fact that, this kind of like wilderness that people thought that they were actually stepping into was in fact, a kind of managed wilderness. And we could talk about like how, this is where my history kind of falls down a little bit, but we know that like vast parts of these forests were kind of managed with fire to produce meadows, to maximize like how deer hunting. And so there was this whole kind of ulterior and indigenous way of understanding the land that was all present, that was kind of erased by this notion of wilderness and nature. And so nature is at the heart, this idea of nature. This is one of the hardest things to do when teaching nature writing, is to really challenge a student's understanding of what nature is. It's seen as a given, but of course it's a term. It's a term with a history, and that history is informed by, it's informed by history, by rhetoric, by culture. And so it's really kind of it's really trying to kind of unpack and undo our understanding of nature, because, a first crack at nature, a nature poem for a student can often be, like, I am going to write a poem about standing on a dock in the Muskokas, seeing the beauty around me, and that beauty being an opportunity to reflect on who I am and what I am. And that's understandable, because it is powerful to be standing on a dock in the Muskokas on a lake as the sun's going down. Like that's, of course. And so that, that can be a nature poem. But, what I try to encourage students to do is to also, unpack all of that and say, okay, what are the Muskokas? What's the history of this place? What territory is it on? What is a dock? How does a dock interact with and change the habitats, ecology of a lake? Why? What is the history? What allows this dock to take place? What are the questions of class, race, ableism? Do we have to ask around this scene that you're kind of taking for granted, and this notion of nature? And it's not the idea that we can't have a profound experience in nature. I mean, I encourage that, but it's also to have one that's textured by our understanding of the history of nature as a problematic term, as this notion of pristine nature, as untouched nature. I think that can reinforce and reproduce, colonial thinking. And so that's why in a lot of my own poetry and my own writing, and when I take students out there, is I try to promote an idea of dirty nature, which is a kind of term that a friend and I came up with, and we've written about it. But this idea of leaving aside this notion of like nature poems have to be about like going out there into the kind of pristine nature and kind of claiming it in a kind of colonial way, reproducing a kind of terra nullius idea, but like attending to nature where you are. Like, what are the bugs and creepy crawlies in your basement? Where, what are the bugs and creepy crawlies in your gut? Like, we are ourselves a biome, a kind of collection of all these kind of like interrelated species. And then what are the kind of like interesting entanglements about what it means to be a human and live lives in a city along a river that's compromised, and the animals and plants and humans and interactions and profound kind of political and social entanglements that you find in those rivers. And can we write about that? Is that a nature poem? Does that kind of like a little bit remake and renew nature poetry, while kind of thinking through nature poetry's more problematic entanglements with colonialism?
It's fascinating. I don't know a lot about poetry or literature, but one of the places that my mind goes is, so I'm from England, and a lot of my memories are, even though I lived in a city, but going to where my mother grew up in this small place. And, there's good and bad, but walking through these trails because of I can't remember what it's called now, but there's a law that says that these historic walking paths are protected. So you can walk. So we walked through fields and clambered over styes and spent, there's all these little bridges, and, we play poo sticks as little kids, and my cousins, like watching the sticks go under the river. And I remember always feeling like craving when you saw a stand of trees, craving the forest, right? And England has its own relationship and history with forest. But then thinking about in the nature poetry that exists in England, right? Which in my mind, I always go to people like Lord Byron and all of these rich people that stood around and wrote and read poems. And one of the stories that always comes back to is my mom read everything as a little girl that she could get her hands on. And she loved Jane Eyre and Jane Austen, like all of these books. And she said to my grandma one day, "Oh, I wish I lived that." And she looked at her and she said, "If you did that, you would be a servant." Because she was a servant. Like my grandma was a servant. She worked in those great houses and didn't talk about it. That was horrific. And when there would be a lord that would walk, that would, sometimes would ride by where they lived in the country, and my grandpa would kind of go hum and ha and say, "Yes, Lord," and bow his head. And he was just a country guy. His brothers were great farmers. He owned a general store. My grandma would get so angry at him afterwards, going, "Why were you bowing your head? Why were you giving him respect? He's just a person like anybody else." And so those are like the relationships that in my head with poetry and nature. And I always think of that sort of who wrote about nature and then who lived it. But I don't know enough that there's anything there. But from your knowledge of nature in the European sort of poetry, is that relationship existing as well with colonialism, and who's privileged enough to have nature, experience nature and think about it? Is that something that's real?
Yeah, and that's kind of what I also kind of trying to push about, like when you're kind of writing your poem about, sitting on a dock in the Muskokas. I mean, that's also like that's about, who has the privilege to, enjoy nature, who goes camping, who can afford to go to Mech. Like Mech, commodifies nature in a certain kind of way. And if you can afford, to buy the gear, then you can, and if you can afford a car to haul a canoe, then you can afford kind of nature, right? If you can afford to get on a plane and fly to a pristine island, then you have access to nature, right? And so, yeah, those are very tied up, tied up with class and privilege. And yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I love poetry too because of its like subversive and revolutionary potential as well. Like I think of like the romantic poets and Blake and Wordsworth and who take a lot of flack, but at the same time they were really challenging. They were really challenging kind of industrialization, the straitjacketing of thinking, of religious dogma, it was Blake who saw London as these dark satanic mills, like this big industrial city, the rise of the city. And so nature was a place to get away from that and to find kind of freedom and to find God and to find all these all these kind of good things. And so it's complex, right? It's like and poetry has this real potential. I mean, in Canada, like asked about colonialism and poetry, I have to bring up like Duncan Campbell Scott, who was considered one of the Confederate poets, right? Like he's a canonical writer, and he's also he is also the mastermind. He is also the father of the residential school system. Those two things come together in a nature poet in the Canadian context. There's a great poem I'll send you by Armand Ruffo. He's a poet, Indigenous poet, and I'm getting his name wrong. So Garnett Armand Ruffo, in response to Duncan Campbell Scott. Duncan Campbell Scott wrote all these poems about nature, and specifically I wrote these poems about Indigenous people that really fall back on and reproduce kind of these stereotypes of indigeneity that, of course, reproduce colonial thinking and colonial logic. And I think that's one thing that I teach, right? This very stunning example of how poetry and colonialism and this history of our nation kind of like go hand in hand. I know that, when the it's not called Canada, it wasn't Canada at the time. Anyway, when the government was making these treaties and like secured treaties like the Huron Tract, they wanted settlers to come over and, farm these areas and become pioneers. And so I in Scotland at the time, and I don't have like specific author names here, but there was these stories, these kind of adventurous stories of pioneers on the frontier that were circulated in Scotland and in England to kind of like, get people excited about the prospect of coming to Turtle Island and becoming pioneers. So it's just, that's that, I'm going back, I'm circling back around to an earlier question, but obviously, who gets who has the right to enjoy nature? I mean, in the United States context, the creating of the national parks, in the progressive era by Teddy Roosevelt, this was about, his idea was that like men are becoming soft and are losing the kind of vim and vigor and masculinity that defines, the American spirit and American freedom. And so we have to preserve, and that, that was created out of this frontier encounter with kind of like otherness and with indigeneity and with wilderness. And so we have to create this park system so that, men can go there and rediscover, that quintessential American experience. Like this was, and so this is who these parks. Oh yeah. Yeah. That, yeah.
I was thinking it was to literally, save precious ecosystems.
I mean,
Wow, that's fascinating.
it was in some ways. I am simplifying all of this, and experts in any. I've become such a generalist on so many things. But if you look at this history and like look at how these camps were, and they were. There were men at the time who were really, trying to take, Roosevelt wrote this whole, Teddy Roosevelt wrote this, his whole book was about how he was like kind of a weak young boy, sick and ailing. And, he became strong and he became healthy when he kind of learned how to ride a horse and how to hunt and how to do all these like manly things. Right. So it's not even like, so yeah, all of our notions of our notions of nature are kind of like bound up in these kinds of notions of masculinity and whiteness and supremacy. Yeah. And so this is the reason why, swamps, wetlands were not created, public parks or protected areas were not swamps, right? One of the most important ecological and places of biodiversity, because you couldn't have a sublime encounter in a swamp. You needed a cliff. You needed to be staring off and, the face of God was not found in a swamp. Right. In fact, swamps in the popular consciousness were places of evil, places where the devil was, like swamps were, but of course, swamps are so important and they're so beautiful and they're so ecologically rich. But again, I don't think you have to look this up, but I think that like the first wetland was kind of preserved in the States, in the 1940s, 30s or 40s, right? So that's, so much again of our notion of nature was kind of, forged by notions of the sublime and the frontier.
So you're making me think. So we're doing at the hospital, we have a Nature for Healing program where we're trying to and we're prescribing nature to patients and families. And we have a friend who's going to record some meditations and for patients, for inpatients and outpatients, and just exposure to nature outside a window has been shown to, decrease pain and opioid use and et cetera, and post-surgical patients, including how long they stay and recover. But now you're making me think we should rename it. But one of the things I do, it is fundamental. I can't recall the person who has created the nature pyramid. This idea of, what nature is it's supposed to be on how much exposure you need, and the very tip of the, once a year, if you can go somewhere preserved and untouched, which is exactly what you've been talking about in terms of, if that's real or not. But this idea that what I cling to is the base of the pyramid, which is, the tree that's growing in the middle of, nowhere, or the grass that's growing in the cracks of the pavement. That's nature that we can, and especially in a hospital, we can take advantage of and we can go and experience. But now I'm starting to think maybe what should we call it?
Nature. I think nature is fine. I think it's good to kind of like, there's a social theorist who said like nature is the most complex term in the English language, because it just like, it means so many different things, right? Like it's like, nature is the wilderness, nature is human nature. It's the way that something is supposed to act. Nature is defined as like against culture or against, it's complex. And so I still, use that term. But I also, I stay away from the environment. I'm trying to, George Monbiot, who I really love reading his work. Is it George? Anyway, he kind of says like, the work for the poets is to find new words for the environment. And he's like, the environment is the flattest kind of thing. And so he started using like the living world which I use a lot too. I like the living world. But yeah, I love what you're saying about like nature can be the tree, nature can be the grass and the cracks. Nature to me is paying attention to where you are. That's simply, nature is paying attention to where you are. And it is not necessarily about, it is so important to go to places that are beautiful and are awe-inspiring and are different and have different animals and different plants. I mean, yes, absolutely. But nature can be understood as a practice. And, whether it's forest bathing, forest bathing in a parking lot with one tree, stand under that tree and start, looking at that tree and seeing what that tree, is all about. Because again, pristine nature creates this dichotomy, this binary between, nature as something out there and human is not nature. And of course, humans are animals. And so look to our own animality and look to the animality that we share, with other species. And I think that those are also access points to nature. And nature can be about, thinking as well, and not just being like the place you are. But again, we built these cities and then we say nature is outside of the cities, and they're not. Like, we're rewilding areas. The whole idea of like rewilding depends on this kind of breaking down this idea that nature exists off somewhere else or on the television screen. It exists like in all the spaces that we occupy. And that's why I find the Indigenous understanding of like, land-based pedagogy or thinking about land acknowledgements means, the land under your feet. This is nature. This is where we are. And so that emphasis, I think, is important. And sure, it's important to get outside but thinking about, there are these cockroaches in the basement of UC Hill, of University College at Western. There's not a lot, but every once in a while I see one and I'm like, oh, look at you down here in this basement of this, of the ivory tower, existing and cockroaching away and finding a way to live and be sustained. And I mean, I'm not a fan of them, but I have to kind of like, contend with them and think about them as nature as well.
What is a poet? Like, who gets to decide when they say they're a poet? Is there or can anyone be a poet? That's just that one piece. I don't know if that's you could get a succinct answer, but since I'm talking to a poet.
Yeah, I am not a gatekeeper of that term. That's for sure. I think you are a poet if you start calling yourself a poet. And I think that poets are attentive to, language and think about language, and language as an art form, but also language as it reproduces a world and reproduces what we understand as reality, and therefore is an important tool in, building and unbuilding our world, our worlds, and communicating with each other and finding, moments of like, beauty and laughter and profound engagement with the natural world. But so I think that, like, for me, I started writing, and for me, starting to call myself a poet was an important part in my evolution as a writer and as an artist and as a kind of like community activist. It was that, to me, it signaled that I now took this very seriously, and it became something that I practiced and that I worked on, and that it's being anything takes a lot of work, right? It's hard to be anything without a lot of work. And so for me, it was also about signaling not to the outside world, but signaling to myself that this was important and this mattered, and that I wasn't, and of course that term comes with so much baggage, right? I mean, you just say the word poetry and you can put people to sleep or send them screaming out of the room, right? Or having arguments about whether, Instagram poetry is a real poetry, or, all these kinds of things, and like embracing that kind of, the complexity of the word. But for me, poetry is forever linked to community. Poetry means writing and sharing what I write and helping others write and asking for help and being part of that community. And for me, it's also just like so importantly connected to the work I do in the community. Like, poetry and the river for me are the same things. They are tributaries, and I am at their confluence.
What a perfect answer. You answered poetically.
I had to stop. When I said confluence, I was like, stop talking. Let there be.
That's it. There you go. That's the profound statement. I love it. It's always something I'm curious about, because it's something that I felt has been a bit inaccessible to me. And so I'm just so curious now, especially as I get older. I realized in my early 20s, I read a lot of poetry, and it makes me, it's very curious. I'm very curious about it.
My number one feedback I give to students, because that's one of the things I love doing is teaching poetry. The number one thing that's hard for emerging writers to figure out is to stop trying to sound like a poem. Because it's like, oh, I have to make this sound like a poem. And it's like, actually, you've been given something that no one else has been given, which is your voice and the way you see the world. And so it's important to read other poetry and to be a sponge and be always like, that's the other thing. Like, I don't think you can be a poet if you're not reading poetry. And that's one thing. Like, I mean, like a lot of people say, yeah, I don't read very much, but I do write. And it's like, that's fine. But like, can you imagine a musician saying, yeah, I write a lot of music. I don't like music though. I don't really listen to it. I mean, that's it. So I think being a writer means you're also a reader. And so you read all that kind of stuff, and that becomes like in your mind, and you're mixing all that stuff up. And it's hard not to be kind of influenced, and you're supposed to be influenced, but also you're supposed to find your own voice. But, I keep reminding, students, like, write in the voice that you were given, write in the voice that you speak to yourself in, and have faith in that voice, that it's important and that it's, valuable, and it has something to say, and that it has, and writers, when you're 10 years old, you don't have a lot of experiences yet, and you're still kind of like aping what you see out in the world. And so, you're some people are kind of born with, that where they pick up a violin and they're just masters. That's not me. And that's, some poets are born that way. But for me, it's like a process of experimentation and learning to trust, loving the craft, learning to trust your voice. And then I really will stop there.
My final question is, what gives you hope?
Some things that give me hope, like my river, this river, our river. I don't know. It sounds counterintuitive, but this river has been around for 10,000 years, and it'll be around 10,000 years from now. It might have changed and moved, and it will probably be maybe around way after humans have left the planet, and there will still be a planet here, and there will still be life forms. And I know that doesn't actually maybe sound hopeful, but it does give me a deep thinking about geological time. Makes me feel like, okay, it gives me some perspective, and again, that existentialism of like rolling the ball up the hill. I mean, that I find that oddly comforting, that we are the meaning makers in our own worlds, and that we have to go out and do that, and that caring for nature and loving nature, even within an apocalyptic kind of landscape, is important and meaningful and beautiful. And that really gives me hope. And also to check my privileged need for hope. I mean, one of my a wonderful writer, Leanne Simpson, Indigenous writer Leanne Simpson, who's written wonderful books and essays and poets, and it talks about apocalypse. And I've heard this actually from a number of like Indigenous artists who kind of say, like, we've been living this apocalypse. We know it intimately. And, if you poison a stream, it's the end of the world for that stream. Like, that's what I remember what Leanne said. I'm paraphrasing it there. And so, there's something about the kind of like privilege of, of thinking about apocalypse and living in apocalypse. And, now finally, like, our attention now is turned on to the care of the planet, because we finally hit the tipping point where all the crap and all the shit that we've done is coming back, and it's and even the most privileged are not going to be sheltered from it. So that's also, I don't know why that necessarily, is about hope, but it has something to do with hope. But more specifically to your question, community gives me hope. The people that I work with and who love the river, and this conversation with you and hearing the way that you just kind of expanded my own thinking, that gives me hope. And I would say that, I think that when it comes to hope, we have to think about it in new ways. I don't think you can find hope. I don't think you should go looking for hope. I think you should make hope. I think hope is something we make by getting to work and by, putting my hands in the river. That gives me hope, because I see the animals that live there, and I see the complexity of their lives and the beauty of their lives and the fact that they're raising families and they're building homes, and that, plants are living there and plants are responding to their environment. And they're so vibrant and alive, and that is, joyful. And so those things kind of, give me hope. So I like to think about hope as something that you earn, hope as something that you make and build together with other people. I know that the first couple of river cleanups that Miriam and I did, there was one in the early days, this was after the first one, that we did by ourselves. And we were in this place that it was very, very a challenging cleanup. There was so much garbage. There was human feces along the river. We were just beginning to kind of encounter the fact that, oh my gosh, so many people are don't have houses and are living along the river and are finding their lives here. And we were encountering all these things and picking up needles at the same time, and, trying to figure out, oh, wow, are we picking up people's belongings here? Should we stop? Should we move away from this area? This is not what we thought this was going to be. And we have to learn these things. And where was I going with this? And being, profoundly feeling alone. We felt alone and like we had bitten off way more than we could chew. And then, people started to come to the cleanups, and they started to see this. And they started seeing what we saw, and they started feeling what we felt. And even though it was hard for us, it lightened the load a little bit, because we realized, oh, you're sharing in this, you're seeing this, you're, because you can feel kind of almost gaslit, like no one. And so as you come together as a community and you share this, that is hope building, right? And that's a really important kind of part of where I see hope is in banding together with people and addressing these issues together. So that's what I'll say in my final comment on how to phone to make.
Yeah. So Sisyphus was building hope.
Sisyphus
rolling his rock.
Yeah, Sisyphus was a meaning maker, and that's what we are. That's what we do, is we make meaning within a context of meaninglessness. And there's, and that for me is beautiful, even as it's terrifying. And, you can't have one without the other.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for listening to Hot Air, Cool People with Dr. Anna Gunz. Special thanks to our guest, Dr. Tom Cull, and the Climate Change, Environment, and Health production team. This episode was produced by Abby Walker, Jakob Wilk, and Abby Peters, and managed by Danielle Pineda and Olivia D'Andrea Brooks. Show artwork was created by Laney Beaulieu. Details and links are in the episode notes. Until next time.